Okay, so I kind of had to end before the chapter ended. So, there, as you remember, the Locktons were having this big dinner, and poor Isabel had to run up and down the stairs 100 times to serve the food and then bring the dirty dishes down and more food, more dirty dishes. So now she's bringing all of the scraps out to the privy, the bathroom. That's where they dumped them. And as she was out there, she was thinking it was going to be cold, and the soldiers were talking about letting the prisoners, who Curzon is now one of, she was wondering if they were going to let them freeze to death. So, anyway, she's saying, would they let him starve? The stars said not a word. The back door banged open, and I jumped. Don't tarry, said Sarah. You need to dry the last of them glasses afore you lay yourself to sleep. Yes, ma'am, as soon as I finish this. I quickly carried the scrap bowl out into the yard, walking past the privy all the way back to the stable wall where straggly holly bushes grew. I glanced quick at the house to make sure no one was watching, then pulled aside the prickly branches of the bush and set the bowl down within it. I covered the bowl with my apron. On my way back to the house, I loaded my arms with firewood. I doubted she'd noticed that I had left the bowl outside, not with me bringing in extra wood. I took another deep breath of the frozen air before I opened the door, confused that I should be so awake after such a long day. I frowned as my thoughts tumbled and multiplied. I had been invaded. A dim plan had hatched itself in my brain pan without my consent, and I did not much like it. So something's going on in her head. Some kind of plan is formulating that she doesn't even know about. Okay, so this is chapter 35. Now we're into December. I had to wait 3 days to sneak up to the prison. My chance came when Madame received an invitation from a friend who had moved into an abandoned rebel mansion in Greenwich Village, north of the city line. Madame smiled in triumph as she read the note, then told me to clean her best shoes. After the midday meal, the soldier wives helped Lady Seymour and Madame into the carriage. I brought out foot warmers filled with hot coals and heavy blankets to lay over the women, for the air was crackling and cold. The driver snapped the whip above the heads of the horses, and the carriage rolled away. The soldier wives waited until it was out of sight, then dashed off to visit their own friends. When they were gone, the house stood empty for the first time in months. I lined my shoes and cap with newspapers to keep out the wind, and emptied the leftovers hiding under the holly bush into a bucket that I covered with an old rag. I stood across the street from the Bridewell prison and pondered hard. Don't do this, my mind was telling me. All around the common, folks went on their business, soldiers rubbing the cold out of their fingers, women wrapped in long cloaks and thick shawls. They walked over the ground where the gallows had been built last summer, where they hung the traitor Hickey. Back in August, the Patriots had torn it down to use the wood for the barricades. The British had built their own hangman's platform at the opposite end of the commons. It could kill 3 people at a time. The ashes in my soul stirred. Don't do this. Men stood at the windows of the prison, calling out to those who passed by. Few folks looked in that direction, pretending that the noise came from the throats of the crows circling overhead. Go back, 'tis not your affair, my mind was saying. The whispers in my brain pan grew louder as I crossed the street. Madam will beat you bloody. He's not your concern. It's not your place. Go back before it's too late. The crows cawed and wheeled and beat their shiny black wings against the wind-whipped clouds. They saw everything. I stopped in front of the iron-studded oak door and frowned. He freed me from the stocks. He is my friend, my only friend. With that, the ashes settled and shushed. My arms lifted light as a feather and pounded the door knocker. A giant guard opened up. What do you want? He growled. He looked like he had been fashioned by setting boulders atop boulders. His hands were iron mallets and his face rough carved out of granite. He was a mountain clothed in lobsterback uniform. Another do-gooder, he grunted when I explained my mission. He lifted the corner of the rag that covered my bucket and sniffed. You got anything tasty in there? Scraps, sir. The mistress normally feeds them to the pigs, but she's a good soul, and told me to bring them for the prisoners. Of course I lied. He grunted, peered into the bucket, and poked through it with a finger. Rice pudding? Yes, sir. The guard crossed the room, took a bowl down from a shelf, and used a spoon to dish the rice pudding from the bucket. And you're kin to this boy you seek? He asked. Yep, my older brother, sir, I lied. Always was a stubborn cuss. Made Mama cry herself to sleep at night. Why ain't your mother here, then? She's dead, sir. Well, that much was true. The guard was more interested in rice pudding than my patchwork story. He shoveled several spoonfuls in his mouth and chewed while looking me over. Come on, then, he said, taking a ring of keys from the hook on the wall. I'll give you a little time. The sound of his key turning in the lock brought back my time in the City Hall dungeons with the madwoman and the rats. Despite the cold, a trickle of sweat inched down my backbone. We walked down a hall lined with 4 doors on each side, and at the end a staircase. He stopped at the last door on the right and unlocked it. Here we go, he said. The cell was little bigger than the one I had been confined in. It was filled with men and boys, milling around like nervous cattle herded into a goat pen. There was no fire burning, nay, not even a hearth where it could burn. A short man dressed in black peered out of the cell's one window, stuck in the middle of the outside wall. The man's collar was flipped up to protect his neck, his hat was pulled down, and his hands were stuck in his armpits for warmth. The window had bars across it, but no glass. It was an empty hole open to the rain, wind, and snow. All turned to stare as we entered. Girl come to see her brother, the guard said. Excuse me, sir, I said, as he started to close the door. What about my bucket? He smiled. It needs further inspection. In other words, he's going to eat all of it. No one said anything, nor moved until the guard finished relocking the door and his footsteps echoed down the hall. You'll be wanting him in the corner, said the short man by the window. Show her. A few of the prisoners stepped to the side so I could see a bundle of rags on the floor. Curzon was lying on the stones, with no blankets covering him, nor a pallet under him, not even straw. His leg was still wrapped in the bloody bandage. His lips were dry and cracked. He clutched his hat in one hand. I crouched next to him, unsure what to do. The soldiers around us grew tired of staring and returned to their low conversing. I leaned close to figure if he was breathing. Finally, I put my lips to his ear. Are you dead? I whispered. He answered without moving. No, Country. Are you? Remember, he used to call her Country. I near jumped out of my skin. Curzon! His eyes opened slow, bloodshot and bleary. Can you sit up? I asked. Suppose so. I helped pull him upright. He winced and leaned against the wall, shaking with chills. Here! I untied my heavy cloak and laid it over him. He protested. You don't have to. I interrupted him. Hush! Did you get shot? He pulled the cloak up under his chin and shivered again. The leg. My luck held, though. Bullet went in and out. Fair. Clean. Didn't break the bone. He stopped as a man nearby broke into a fit of coughing. I sat next to him. Was it awful? I asked. He closed his eyes and shook his head. You don't want to know. Yes, I do. When the redcoats invaded, he started, we raced up the island to the fort, figured we'd hold there for months, then drive them from the city come spring when our forces would be stronger. Ha! Spat the man closest to us. He rolled over to face the wall. Did you shoot a gun? I asked. Mostly dug ditches and carried rocks. The soldiers, they worked alongside us, and they drilled to get ready. When the battle finally started, the men fired their guns so fast the barrels grew hot. The cannon smoke was thick as fog. I saw the most horrid sights, country, not fit for the eyes of any person. He swallowed hard. I wound up next to a militia boy from Connecticut. He had just learned to shave and was a poor hand at it, razor cuts all over his chin. Said he was worried his pa was mad at him on account of he didn't make it home for the apple harvest like he had promised. He fell silent for a moment, then continued. So, this boy, he had 2 muskets, one his own, the other from a fellow who died on Long Island. When the Hessian came at us, the boy would shoot one gun while I reloaded the other. We continued thus, loading and shooting half the day. The British moved their small cannons up the hill and took aim, but I loaded. He shot. He paused to wipe his eyes on his sleeve. As I handed him his gun, a cannonball ripped his head from his body. We sat without a word. The ashes within me swirled and filled up my throat again. Around us men muttered low and coughed. Curzon let his tears run. After that, I shot the guns for myself, took the bullet in my leg, but kept firing. An hour or so later, Colonel McGaw surrendered the fort. We laid down our weapons and walked out. The British called for our officers to walk forward, and we feared they'd be shot. Were they? I asked. Not hardly. He sat up a little straighter. Officers get special treatment on account of they're considered gentlemen. They have parole to walk around the city. They live in boarding houses and eat regular. The man who faced the wall muttered a string of curses that echoed against the stones. He said every kind of bad word imaginable about officers, gentlemen, the war, the British, and the Congress, and he cursed himself for leaving his wife and farm in Maryland. Curzon's tears dried, leaving a thin trail of salt down his cheeks. You should go home now. Before I could ask one of 100 questions, the key turned in the lock and the guard appeared. He stuck out my bucket. Inspection complete, he said, wiping a smear of butter off the side of his face. I stood, walked to the door, and looked in the bucket. Half of the food was gone. May I stay a while longer? I asked. Sing out when you need me, the guard said with an unsettling wink. As soon as the door was relocked, a man with powder burns on his face snatched the bucket from my hands. I'll take that, he snarled. I held tight to the handle and shouted, Give it back! The man grabbed my arms, his fingers like the claws of a panther. Enough! Shouted a powerful voice. The cell fell silent as a tomb. The short man, dressed in black, limped over to us from his post by the window. Release that bucket, Private Dibdin, he ordered. The thief did as he was asked, but crossed his arms over his chest and stood his ground. She brought food for the black boy, Sergeant, he complained. 'Tain't right for the slave to eat while we starve. The tiny sergeant stood motionless. Somewhere water was dripping. No one here will starve long as I have breath, he turned to me. Excuse the poor manners, miss, but we've not eaten for 3 days. Hungry men are sometimes rude. I understood, I said. Would you be willing to share what you've brought, he asked. We would all be most grateful. I looked the sergeant in the eye. He wasn't much taller than me. There's not enough food to feed everyone, I said. I know that, miss, but we're all equal hungry. Don't fuss, country, Curzon asked. We fought together, we'll eat together. Outside, a heavy cart rolled down Broadway, the driver calling to his horses. There was an argument from the cell on the other side of the wall, and a thump from the one above. I handed the bucket to Curzon. The nasty man dug his claws into my shoulder. The sergeant goes first. I waited for him to release me, fighting the urge to bite his wrists down to the bone. Once he let go, I gave the bucket to the sergeant. He looked inside and pulled out a piece of pie crust the length of my finger. He handed the bucket to Curzon, who removed a long parsnip peel. The bucket made its way around the room at a snail's pace as each man studied the contents and chose a small portion of discarded potato or bread or gristle. When it was returned to me, I was confuddled. There's still food in here. All right, so I'm going to have to stop there. So they're eating all of the leftover scraps from the Lochtons' big meal, but that's all they have.